Welcome to this month's Schuman Talk, where we discuss issues we face in Europe today in the light of Robert Schuman's vision for a community of peoples deeply rooted in Christian values. 71 years ago, on May the 9th, 1950, at 6 p.m., at the Quai d'Orsay in Paris, the French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman gave a 3-minute speech in which he laid the foundation for the European house, in which today 500 million Europeans live together in peace. This was the defining moment of post-war Europe, for it launched a European movement for peace and unity that has led to today's European Union. Speaking of a world peace to end centuries-old rivalry and of Europe's shared destiny and responsibilities to the world, he then proposed an economic project that was a political expression of Christian ideals of forgiveness and reconciliation. The proposal was for a European coal and steel community involving partner nations to cooperate in the production of coal and steel in mutual accountability, making the creation of a national war machine impossible. There has been unprecedented peace between EU member states ever since. In his book, A Soul for Europe, Robert Schuman said, "The project of European integration cannot and must not remain an economic and technical enterprise. It needs a soul, which is the conscience of its historical affinities." In other words, the values that come from the worldview values, from the worldview that shaped historically Europe, and he had in mind Christianity there, and of its responsibilities in the present and in the future, plus a political will at the service of the same human ideal. And he had in mind here particularly a Christian understanding of ideals and values. And so tonight, we're going to be looking at this relationship between the spiritual values and the political side of Europe as we talk with Julia Doxat-Purser, with Christel Ngnambi, and Arie de Pater, all of whom have spent time in Brussels working for the European Evangelical Alliance office there. And we're going to be exploring, well, what really does the gospel have to do with politics? You see, for over 25 years, the European Evangelical Alliance has been present in Brussels, lobbying for freedom of religion and belief, as well as other issues. And we're going to be exploring tonight what has been achieved. So I want to say welcome to Julia, welcome Christel, welcome Arie. I'm going to be talking with each one of you individually, but Julia, I believe that you first started working there in Brussels for the EEA in 1993, is that correct?
Yes.
And Christel, in 2006. You were there for about 11 years.
That's
and
correct.
Arie, you took over Christel's role in 2017, and that's where you are operating today. Even though your name label says Gouda, you actually are working in Brussels. And Christel, even though you are presently in Brussels right now, you are now living in Dusseldorf. This is just to confuse us all. And Julia actually operated the office out of England and Hull for a number of years as well. And so we're talking to each other now from several different nations, which is really, what we're getting used to, especially through Corona. But this is the reality of Europe today, of linking together across the old borders that used to be barriers, but are now being seen as places of contact and where we can work together. So we will give an opportunity for our listeners to post any questions that they have for you as we come through, and we'll come back together again at the end where we will address any possible questions that come up as well. So right now, I'm going to focus on Julia, as she was the first one involved, and then we'll come back to Christel and Arie as we go along. So, Julia.
Yes.
Politics and the gospel. What really does the gospel have to do with politics?
Well, if you stop and think about what's in the Bible, of course, it's God's salvation story, God's love story to the world, but it is full of politics. It's full of the fact that God cares, yes, about our souls and our eternity with him, but he cares about this world now. In Genesis, Adam and Eve were asked to be stewards of God's earth. So they were given a mandate right at the beginning to care for the environment, to care and to run things properly. And politics comes from the word polis, which is, I think, Greek for the affairs of the city. Politics is what anyone who wants to, they engage in deciding what's important in society, what's not important, what will be allowed and encouraged, what will be not. And of course, God cares. And of course, his values are important in politics. And you meant, the gospel, what's it got to do with the gospel? Well, in the purest sense, if we want people to become Christians, and I do, then if they are too absorbed with their drug addiction, or they are a migrant who drowned in the sea trying to come to Europe, they can't hear the gospel. So in the purest sense, politics is important. And then also politics is important, the foundational issue of us having freedom to witness, freedom to meet as Christians. If you care about nothing else, then surely we would care about that, and therefore politics is important. I could go on forever. I do courses and stuff.
Well, of course, how we think about God affects our understanding of human beings and of society. And humans and society, that's what politics are all about. So the very first determining factor about politics is really how we think of God. You see, if we say that there is no God, then that'll put a whole different spin on how we go about our politics. But if we understand that there is a God, and if we understand, in fact, I just wrote something this last week about Hugo de Groot, or Hugo Grotius. In fact, there's a statue of him just a couple of 100 meters from where I am right now, and he's known as the father of international law. And it was from his Christian understanding that he has laid the foundation for international law as we have it today. So this comes as a surprise to some people who think, well, politics is such a dirty business, it's not a place where Christians should be. But maybe we should say that's the very reason why Christians should be there.
Absolutely. Salt and light. If the world of politics is rotten, it's because the salt's not there. If it's dark, it's because the light's not there. We have a job to engage. And I love, you just mentioned the statue near where you live. I just love the example of Christian heroes, both past and present, who have changed the world, who've got involved in public life and brought in justice, brought in righteousness, brought in care for the vulnerable and the poor. And the Bible's full of commands that we must do that, brought in integrity. There's a lot of bad in politics, but there's also an awful lot of good from the Christians and also non-believers who, they mean well, they want to make the world a better place. We may decide that we don't agree with what they're doing, but their heart is in the right place.
Now, if we understand the role of government is really to uphold justice and to provide a level playing field for all parties in society, it's very hard to define what justice really is if we think, well, we're just a kind of a chance product of a materialistic process, and who's to decide what justice is? And so whether we're talking about city government, national government, or European government, justice is the issue, and that righteousness is the issue. And surely this is what we pray for when we pray the Lord's Prayer. May your kingdom come. In other words, may your rule, may your justice be established here in Europe as it is in heaven, and or even in our own city, wherever we think. So now, so you've been working there in Brussels. Why is it important to have an office for the European Evangelical Alliance in Brussels?
Because the Bible calls us to pray for our political leaders, and whether you like the European Union or not, it is a political institution that influences all the member states. And so we should be praying, we should be getting involved. And when I lived in Brussels, I could see that every worldview and every flavor of faith, Christianity and other faiths, were seeking to influence, but evangelicals were not. And so we needed to be involved. And the European Evangelical Alliance, I thought, needed to be involved because it's the body that does represent evangelicalism across Europe, not just the European Union. So I'm British, Brexit's happened, but I'm still part of the EEA, and so we're still engaging, and it has a representative structure within EEA in order so that when we speak in Brussels, we are doing it on behalf of our members and involving our members, etc.
So what are we talking about in terms of numbers of people? How many? Who are you representing?
I've forgotten the number. You'll have to ask Arie that.
Okay, well, I know
it's something like 20 million. I can't quite remember. 23 million.
Well, okay. It's not the 20 million people even know that there's an EEA office, but but basically that's what the European Evangelical Alliance talks about.
Yes.
20 million. Now, evangelical.
And we don't consult them all. Obviously, we can't consult them all, but we have when we explore a new policy area. So on religious freedom, it's obvious what we would believe, but say on a new area, perhaps on artificial intelligence or whatever it might be, we have an authorization team. So this is a small group of people connected to national evangelical alliances, and if we come up with a new idea, they have to approve it. And we're making sure that every corner of Europe is represented. And if they approve it, then we have a script and then we can work. So there is a representative function, and we're listening to our members. So some issues like refugees can be controversial. So where do we agree and what can we say?
Well, the word evangelical is a bit of a nasty word in the press these days, largely because of what has taken place in America. Do you want to say something about that, what we're not?
Well, you can pray for Arie, who still has to go into the European Parliament with the European Evangelical Alliance on his business card. And so, yes, there can be a negative impression. But EEA, we are confident in who we are. We are confident in the gospel. We're confident in the Bible. We are very... we're not coming across in any sort of culture war kind of way. And usually we can get past the prejudice that there might be. So evangelicals and evangelical alliances unite all Christians who see that the Bible is the highest authority rather than church tradition, the Pope, anything else.
Yeah, without taking the Bible fundamentalistically and developing all sorts of end time plans, which has sometimes been associated with the word evangelical.
Well, they're part of the family. They're part of the family.
Yes, right.
In other words,
we would have, from the left to the right.
Yes.
And it's not just free church people, but we'd find evangelicals in mainstream denominations, even in Catholics as well.
Pentecostal, charismatic, Reformed, Baptist.
Yes. So what are you doing there in Brussels? What did you used to do there? And what is Arie doing now? It's basically you're trying to influence.
Yes, we're trying to influence. We're trying to encourage the EU when it's got a good idea and it's doing good. We try to encourage them to do more. So, for example, on religious freedom, you're going to listen to the others and they will tell you more about how we've persuaded the EU to do more on religious freedom. Yes, and then occasionally we seek to try and stop the bad. So, for example, in my time, the most significant thing I worked on was the EU is bringing in a new employment directive. So a directive is a law to stop discrimination in the workplace, which generally was good. But the original draft did not give any exceptions for example, a church to make sure that when they employed a pastor, that they were a Christian, which is blindingly obvious that should have been there, but it was not in the original. And it actually took a lot of lobbying for them to think, oh yes, where the job it's obvious that it needs to be someone of faith, that there can be an exception. So we were able to stop something bad within a directive which was generally good. When I say we, it wasn't just EEA. There was
by having an office in Brussels. Does that mean that the EEA is pro-EU?
It is and it isn't. So we are pro the EU when it does good. We are not so keen on the EU where we don't like what it says. We obviously, the origins of the EU, the fact that it was back in 1950, it was all about reconciliation and stopping war. Of course, we're for that. So it is irrelevant really whether we are pro-EU or not. It exists, the EU. We need to pray for it. We need to seek to bring out the good in it. Yes.
But it's recognizing that all human beings have a faulty streak, and power can go the wrong direction. And so whatever form it is, it constantly requires monitoring, prophetic input where possible.
Yeah.
I had somebody say to me recently that they felt the EU was becoming so secular that that's why Christians should pull out, or certain nations should pull out, and so forth. But it would seem to me that that's a recipe for for accelerating that process.
Yes, it is. I mean, the 1990s, when I was around in Brussels, it was a very different time. And since then, it's as if the Christian focus and the secular focus, both of them have got stronger. Generally, I would say the EU is more secular than it was. But of course, there are still, there's a strong Christian influence among many of the member states. And in the end, it's the member states that are in charge. And there are still so many Christians who work in the institutions, the Parliament, the Commission, the Council, etc. So there are an awful lot of Christians beavering away, praying, working. You could say they are like, Joseph working for Babylon, but they're there, they're making a difference. I'm sorry, not Joseph, Daniel working for Babylon, but Daniel was prime minister and he did make a difference. We're supposed to be getting involved. So yes, secularism is an issue, but we should only really withdraw if absolutely God tells us to, and actually God put Daniel into Babylon, God put Joseph into Egypt to make a difference. So
what you're saying is there is a place for Christians always to be involved, or believers to be involved, whatever kind of dictatorship it may be, autocratic situation, the kind of empire that Paul encouraged believers to pray for was, the Roman Empire. It was hardly
Nero. He was in prison or about to be in prison. Yes, so it's whether you like the political structure or not is irrelevant. We're called to pray, to bless, and some of us are called to go and influence or even work there.
Yeah, now we can feel very overwhelmed by that task, but the Bible is full of stories of just individuals who made a difference, Esther being one of them. And the advice, the words to Esther from her uncle was, who knows, but you've been brought to the kingdom for such a time as this.
Yeah.
So this office actually began with you, Julia. Tell us about the start of the EEA in Brussels.
I said we started in 93. That's because, I thought it started in 90. It started beginning of January 1994, but I got the job in 1993. Okay. Really, the story began 3 years before in 1990. I know, Jeff, you talk a lot about Jacques Delors, who was president of the European Commission at the time, and he addressed church leaders and said that Europe needs a soul, help us. And the first time he said that was at a private meeting with church leaders in November 1990. And it so happened that I had just started working at the Ecumenical Centre next door to the European Commission. And the church leaders came back and I was serving them drinks at a reception. And they were buzzing with excitement that the president of the European Commission, Jacques Delors, had asked for the church's help to give a soul to the European institutions. And I was just serving the drinks, but it was sort of, whoa, this is exciting. And I was working at the Ecumenical Centre and just learning about the EU and influence. And then you turned up, Jeff. And one or two other Christian leaders from across Europe turned up. And you met me and you met other Christians in Brussels. And I think I nagged you and said, come on, evangelicals, when are you going to turn up and get more involved? Every other worldview is here. And you and others sort of helped bring about the European Evangelical Alliance deciding to open an office, and they gave a young woman called Julia Doxat-Purser the chance to be the first representative.
Well, she wasn't called Julia Doxat-Purser.
No, I was Julia Purser at the time, and then I got married, finished my honeymoon, and started with Eea. So it all happened at once.
Yes. Well, maybe I should just add something here. I had just taken my leadership team of Youth with a Mission to Brussels to ask, well, tell us what it's all about. How should we think about this? Because I've been asking around a lot of senior people, what should we think about Brussels? There were all sorts of ideas. Well, it's the beast. We should keep away from it, and so on. And I'd had this meeting with an official there with our team. And the first thing he said as he came in the room was, shall we begin with prayer? And that shocked us. That was the last thing we expected. And he began to tell the story that I heard for the first time about Robert Schuman and the reconciliation, the forgiveness. And I realized there was a whole Christian story right at the heart that I'd never heard about before. I'd heard about all these, Roman conspiracies, etc. And so I asked this man, and I think you remember him, Eamon O'Rourke, would he help us set up a consultation the next year to bring evangelical leaders together to hear the story and to wrestle with the question, what is our responsibility? Do we have a responsibility here? And so that then my colleague Jan-Piet de Visser, who was a YWAM leader in Brussels at the time, said, hey, you need to meet Julia. So that's when we got together. And I asked you to help me set up this Europa 92. And there we had a number of very interesting people. Jacques Delors' right-hand man was speaking there. There was one of the commissioners, Christine, I forget her surname now. But there's the Fred Catherwood.
Yes, I forgot her name.
What was her name?
It was the French one. I can't remember who it was.
Anyway, it was Sir Fred Catherwood, who was the Vice President of the European Parliament, who came. Now, actually, he's a true blue evangelical. His father-in-law was Martin Lloyd-Jones. And Sir Fred had written a book called Pro-Europe, which never became a bestseller in England for obvious reasons. But he brought such biblical thinking to the task, and he became a major mentor without him knowing it for me in helping to think through, challenges as we thought of examples of people like Nehemiah and Esther and Daniel and so on, and realized that there was a real place for Christians there. So you played that role, and then actually the man who was taking over the general secretary role of the EEA at the time, Stuart McAllister, he was part of the same event, and that's where he asked you to take on this job. So that's where it began. But I think you and I go back 30 years here, but you actually didn't start the job until 93, 94. So
we were all children at the time, obviously.
What other Christian presence is there in Brussels?
Well, obviously they've got all the individual Christians who work in the institutions, and their prayer groups and their alpha groups. There are prayer rooms. There's the European Prayer Breakfast. But there's also more and more Christian groups. So like European Evangelical Alliance, so you've got Christian Solidarity Worldwide, you've got Christian development agencies, humanitarian agencies, Alliance Defending Freedom. Yeah, there will be others that I don't know because I haven't been in Brussels for a while that maybe Arie and Christel could tell you. So there are plenty of groups, and we on European Christian Political Movement. So that's sort of a family of Christian political parties. There's
two main bodies that represent a large part of the Christian Europe. Commercy, the Catholic.
Yes, the ecumenical ones, yes.
And then the Conference of European Churches, KEC, and that was what you were associated with in an earlier
Yes, they're the ones who've been around for ages, and it was the evangelicals who relate to the party.
And what kind of input do they have into the European Union?
Well, you need to ask the later Brussels reps.
Well, okay, let me.
There is an official dialogue.
Well, a lot of people get upset about the fact that the name of God was not mentioned in the Constitution. But what we need to know is that there's something called Article 17. Is that right? Number 17?
Yeah. Yes,
which guarantees a dialogue. Go on, you tell us about it.
Yes, no. When Jacques Delors said Europe needs a soul, and ever since after that, he started this regular dialogue with the churches and then with other faiths joining in, and non-religious groups like the humanists. And yes, in the treaties now, I think it's Article 17, it says that there must be regular dialogue with the faith communities. And so there are meetings, there are papers. So there's that official dialogue, but there's also, with our work, we've always found the institutions very open. So if you have something useful to say and of relevance, they will listen. So be it the European Commission, be it obviously MEPs, they thrive on information if it's packaged correctly. There is a great openness. Yes, there's secularism. Yes, there can be you're evangelical, but if you've got something useful to say, then it's fine. I get sad. We get sad sometimes because there is a bit of a culture war sometimes on certain issues. But we try to get around the culture war. We try to build bridges with unlikely allies. That's not always possible, but we do try. Yeah.
Now I'm going to ask Irina, who's our technician behind the scenes and making everything happen, to bring up the slide that shows the Brussels affirmation. This was a statement that came out of our time in Europa 92, and it's far too long for us to go through right now, but the next slide shows some of the main points. That it was, we were calling ourselves to repent from apathy towards engagement, as we need to recognize that our political position really doesn't jive with a biblical position, that we have a responsibility. We need to recognize that government is a God-ordained sphere, that politicians are called God's servants. They are there to serve the people within God and a God-ordained framework, and that we have a duty to pray for our leaders, and that the original EU vision was for peace, not for wealth and so forth, really, but for peace, working together. But that there are areas of concern that we need to keep monitoring, which is really why the EEA has had an office there. At the same time, lots of doors of opportunity. And that we recognize that the issues facing us in Europe today require biblical responses. And Christians need to be saying, this is how we should be responding to this issue, not for the sake of just making money and so on. And so often, the original vision has gotten lost sight of. And that the gospel has both a preserving, a salt function, and a saving function, light, to transform every area affected by sin. And that is actually every area of life has been affected by sin, including politics. And that's why we need a gospel witness there. Okay. Well, Julia, my last question to you is, what does it mean to be a what do we call you? The religious liberty coordinator. That's one of your roles, right? Still.
Yes, I'm not Brussels rep anymore. I'm socio-political and religious liberty coordinator. Religious liberty coordinator means it's a way of making sure that EEA's socio-political team keep religious freedom as our #1 priority. And we work with our members to working together to respond to challenges of religious freedom within Europe. We work with our members to equip them so that they can respond to their own problems. But we also, one of my favorite things is to build collaboration. So we have an annual gathering of Christians who work on religious freedom. So it will be Evangelical Alliances, European Baptists, researchers like Forum 18, groups like CSW, Open Doors, lawyers groups like ADF, loads of people. So there's a strong partnership of people, which means that we can respond fast when there are problems. But it also means that we work together to track the trends of what's going on and think about the wisest responses. So that's the job.
Okay. Now, there's another area you're involved in as well, the European Freedom Network. Can you just say something about that as well?
Yes, that's about human trafficking and sexual exploitation. And when it was the Wilberforce bicentenary of when he brought an end to slavery in the British Empire, many Christians said, hey, we need to do something about modern slavery. And so I started just connecting people together so that they weren't reinventing the wheel, but connecting with organizations that already reached out to people in prostitution, that were already working on slavery issues. And we now have this huge network called the European Freedom Network, europeanfreedomnetwork.org. So I can't remember how many partners, but hundreds of partners across Europe. Also, we're now developing resources for churches. So, ordinary local church, what's your role in being a welcoming, restoring community? I'm not an expert on these issues, but I guess my expertise is bringing people together and then developing the advocacy side as well. So we're working with Arie, our EA Brussels rep, to develop a voice into Brussels.
Well, thank you, Julia. We're going to come back to you in a little bit, but I want to ask a few questions now. Christel, who was your successor. So, Christel, what difference does an EEA office in Brussels make?
Well, the mission of the Brussels office, when it was started, was to represent evangelical Christians. And, one of the ideas of the European Union is to be a representative democracy, and even more so a participative democracy. And one of the core ideas is to invite citizens to participate in decision-making. We've already said that there are 23 million evangelical Christians today. By the way, this is a growing number. When I started, I think the number was 15 million. A good number of them are citizens of the European Union. And therefore, as citizens, just like any citizen of the European Union, there is a role for citizens to have their voice represented. So the core mission is to have this voice represented in a number of debates, discussions, and decisions that are made. Also,
that's more than the whole population of the Netherlands, by the way, Christel.
Yes. Yes, indeed. Yeah. Yes. And there's a number of issues, right? There's a variety of issues. So we've engaged in discussions on poverty and precariousness, on environmental issues, on migration. And the number one issue has already been mentioned. That's religious freedom, or to use the standard term used for it is freedom of religion or belief. Which has been a number one ever since the Evangelical Alliance as a movement was started in 1846, even long before the Conference of European Churches or the World Council of Churches existed. The Evangelical Alliance as a movement had this fundamental belief that religious freedom should be a core issue for evangelicals, and religious freedom for all, the defense of religious freedom for all. So in the context of our work on behalf of human rights, when I was a Brussels representative, we participated in a number of campaigns to help the European Union take religious freedom more seriously and include it especially in its external affairs.
Why is it so important to talk about religion and belief? Add and belief.
Yes, so there are several reasons. One of I think probably the reason that will be mostly cited nowadays is just to make a distinction between systems of beliefs that are identified as religions, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, etc., and systems of beliefs that do not self-identify as a religion, so secular humanism and other systems of beliefs. But more authentically, according to me, this phrase "religion or belief" is there just to cover all systems of deeply held beliefs. And I know that a number of evangelicals have this at heart, not for Christianity or the belief in Christ not to be considered mainly as a religion, as a sort of organized system, but as a core part of who we are, of our identity, and the framers of the concept of freedom, religious freedom, freedom of religion or belief, had that idea in mind. So you don't have to claim that you have a religion to be protected by this fundamental right, which is, Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It is part of the most fundamental rights.
Yes. Well, that leads us to talk about the Global Charter of Conscience. Tell us about that.
Well, we talked about religious freedom quite a bit since the beginning of our time, and I'm sure that some of our listeners might have sort of second thoughts about religious freedom. It's a fairly known fact that religion generally is not necessarily seen under a positive light, and what we have observed in decision-making circles, in international circles, is that religious freedom, or the presence of religion in society, has often been reinterpreted according to what I would call an exclusivist, secularist worldview, which does not understand religion as well as it could otherwise. And we've seen that core understanding, quite inclusive understanding of religion's freedom weakened. I remember when I was a Brussels representative, I was part of an event organized by the unit of the European Union, which deals with external affairs, and it was about human rights. And I introduced myself, working for the European Evangelical Alliance, and participated in the meeting. And they wanted to get views from civil society about the guidelines that the European Union should abide by when it would promote religious freedom outside. Very early stages. After the meeting, in the corridor, that's often where the most important stuff happens, right? In the corridor and after the meeting, I introduced myself more personally, handed my business card, and the woman who was leading the meeting on behalf of the EU said, "Oh, yes, I read well. I heard you well. So Evangelical Alliance, right?" And I said, "Yes." And she told me, "We don't do God, don't you?" A matter of saying, "I doubt that you have a right or a legitimacy to be here." And my answer to her was, "Well, I heard that, but I think you do human rights, don't you?" And that was the challenge. The Global Charter of Conscience is this effort. The text was drafted by Os Guinness, who's a well-known writer and public speaker, and then it was introduced in a number of decision-making circles. It was also vetted and supported by dozens of clerics and intellectuals. Charles Malik, who is the son of actually one of the people who drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and also recommended by the person we call the Special Rapporteur on Religious Freedom, so the United Nations person on religious freedom at the time, Heiner Bielefeld. And this is an effort of reinterpreting correctly religious freedom and re-explaining that is a core freedom. It is actually it's one of the most fundamental human rights we have. It is absolute, so nobody can question it. Of course, the manifestations of religion are subjected to law. But in a world where our decision makers tend to believe that religion is either irrelevant or maybe nasty, maybe not so good for public life, we believe that it was important to reinstate its importance. And I must say the reception was really positive. That document originally drafted by an evangelical, opened a lot of doors, and was received and acclaimed by people from various worldviews, including the most secularist decision makers.
Now, here's an important point. It was having to be expressed in terms that people understand, and we haven't always been very good at that. We speak to ourselves and we speak our own language, but we have to learn how to actually speak these concepts in ways that really connect with people and answer the questions that people are asking. And there's a widespread myth that, well, you have religious people and then you have the neutral people, people who don't believe. But in a sense, there's no such thing as a non-believer. And that's why that phrase, religion and belief, is very important, because we're all believers in something.
That's right.
And secularism is not neutral. Exclusivist humanism is not neutral. It's based on beliefs. And we have to learn how to challenge and bring out these unconscious presuppositions that people have.
Right.
Yeah. So in terms of, can you give examples of where the office has made a difference?
Well, there's certainly one example that I could cite in the context of religious freedom, and if we have time, I could cite another one, and that's connecting to the comment you just made. I believe that too often we as Christians believe that some people in the world are against us and can never be won by what we have to say. But I see a lot of parallels there between the public advocacy and mission or evangelism. So if you seek to evangelize, if you are sent as a missionary far away or close to where you are, you will have to observe and understand the culture and the reference points and the worldviews and the values of the people you are trying to connect with. And that's exactly what we try to do, for example, with the Global Charter of Conscience. We also participated back in 2006 in the foundation of a platform called the European Platform on Religious Intolerance and Discrimination, bringing together organizations of various worldviews to work together in the promotion of religious freedom, practicing what we preach in order to promote what we value. And I want to say this really to underline the fact that, there isn't a political bubble or world out there which is completely separate or cannot be reached, and I use that word on purpose, cannot be reached by Christians. It's a matter of articulating the language and the values we have and the gospel itself in a manner that other people can access it. I remember one day when we were promoting the Charter of Conscience. Of course, in political worlds, you need a document. So we had this document, and I was walking with Os Guinness in the corridors of the European Council in Brussels, and we met that same representative who told me years before, we don't do God. and she was much more open by then. And we had this conversation, and at a certain point, Os Guinness articulated what you just said. He said, Christians have beliefs, but you as a secular humanist, you also have a belief system. And we also want you to be free to express it, but also renounce it if you believe that it's, no longer good and you want to embrace another one. And we want these freedoms to be granted everyone. So there is a political impact, at a systemic level, but there's also, I can't count the number of personal conversations, even evangelistic conversations that I've had, because decision makers who are not Christians or influential people, they had questions or they had they wanted to better understand what the Christian worldview was about. Explaining the crucifixion in the ministry of the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs to to someone who had spent a day studying religious freedom, for instance. So that's one dimension of the impact. The other one is really a structural one in religious freedom. We participated when I was a Brussels representative in drafting an official document called the European Union Guidelines on the Promotion and Protection of Freedom of Religion or Belief. And that document, which cost a lot of hours of drafting together with other NGOs and church representatives, is still being used today by the European Union and by the dozens of embassies, they're called delegations, that the EU has across the world. They're using that to promote and defend religious freedom, to promote and defend the protection of persecuted people who are persecuted because of their faith. So that, for me, is really an example of the impact we can have. And there are also other areas. Migration is one of them in which we have engaged.
Yeah. Now, some Christians would think, well, that means that you are actually promoting freedom for Muslims to express, to worship in Europe. Is that something we really want? How do you answer that?
I would answer yes, that's something we want. One of the first campaigns of the Evangelical Alliance back in the mid 19th century was a campaign to protect the rights of Catholics to worship according to their faith in Sweden, a Lutheran country, back at that time. Defending religious freedom means defending it for everyone. We believe we're all created by God. We all have this dignity, which is the foundation of our fundamental rights. It is the foundation of freedom of conscience, because God has given us a conscience, and God calls all people to Him. He wants people to come to Him through conviction, and conviction is an act of the conscience, and the conscience must be free. It can't be tampered with by the authorities. If we refuse a certain right or certain freedom to a group in society, as unpopular or as criticizable as they are, then we should not be surprised that other people would want to refuse that right to us. So it's either for everyone or it's for no one.
So, Christel, you were involved in the Brussels office for 11 years, and then in 2017, Arie took over your role. So let's hear from Arie, and we'll all come back together again after after Arie and I have had a chat. Thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure.
On Sunday, June the 20th or June the 27th, it's going to be a very special day called the World Refugee Sunday. Arie, what is that? And why is it necessary?
Yeah, well, it's been there for over a decade. I think the World Evangelical Alliance started World Refugee Sunday in 2011. The United Nations, they are observing UN World Refugee Day on the 20th of June, and we always, as of 2011, there is this Refugee Sunday to focus and increase awareness for the refugees that are on our doorsteps or much further away, and they are in very difficult circumstances, and it is good to realize that they are there. We might be quite comfortable in our quite comfy bubbles here in the West, but many people they fled natural disasters, they fled wars, and there are an estimation is that there are over 80 million refugees, and that includes internally displaced people. So many of them will be internally displaced, which means that they are still in their own country, but still they left all their possessions and their livelihood.
80 million, Arie, that's as many people who live in Germany or in Turkey, the whole population, just to kind of help us get it in our minds. That's an enormous amount, but we don't hear so much. We don't talk about a refugee crisis right now. It seems like Europe's got it under control. Is that the case? Is the EU? Is it handling this whole situation in a way that would reflect the character of God?
Well, that might depend on who you ask, but no, I would strongly disagree. Let's remember first that out of these 80 million people, most of them are still in the region. So there's a lot of talk about receiving people or keeping people in the region. So in Africa, in one of the neighboring countries, countries like Ethiopia, but also Lebanon is hosting millions of refugees, way more than come to the European Union. And as long as people are languishing in camps at the European border or on European territory, you can't say that we have it under control. People are still waiting for years to get any clarity about whether they can stay. Many of them are living in camps under very poor conditions. So you can't say that we have it under control.
No. What can you do about it? What is the EEA office doing about it?
Well, we are working in Brussels. We are working with many other organizations, trying to raise awareness and to make sure that the rules that that the European Union is setting for refugees, the procedures in place, are humane and are based on solidarity, because. Well, we've all seen the pictures from Italy, from Greece, and other border areas where people are really suffering. So we are calling to the European Union to show solidarity, but it's also something that is important for all the member states, because Europe, that's us. So it's good to say, well, we should, well, you Greece, you should treat them more humane, or Italy, you should protect them better. But if there is no backup, if there's no support and solidarity from other European member states, we haven't solved the issue. We haven't solved anything. And that's an ongoing debate in Brussels. So we're talking kind of both ways. We're talking to the European Union to raise awareness, because so often policymakers are talking about figures, about numbers, about statistics. But this is about human beings. There are 80 million individual stories out there of people explaining why they left everything and got on the move. So
it was exciting, Arie, in the news today that it was announced there's going to be a special refugee category of athletes at the Olympic Games that will march in under the Olympic flag, and this will help to highlight the plight of many of these people. What would you like to say to your listeners about how they can be involved in World Refugee Day? What can they do? What can we do?
Well, there are several resources on the World Evangelical Alliance website. So what you can do is just, in your sermon, if you observe World Refugee Sunday, dedicate one sermon or one service to the plight of refugees. Invite refugees to your church, to your service. Hear their stories. Reach out to them. Organize an offering. Support a project, whether that's local or whether that's international, whether you support any international refugee ministry or you support a local project that is reaching out to refugees. But anything that would create that awareness and build that link with refugees is important.
So thank you, Arie. This is one project you're working on, but there are many other things too. Would you like to say anything about the other projects that you're working on?
Yeah, well, my colleagues already mentioned freedom of religion or belief, and that's a long-term priority for the Brussels office. So we're still working with the European institutions to promote and defend freedom of religion or belief. So recently,
what does that look like on a this last month? What have you been doing to work on that? Well, it sounds very vague.
Yeah. Okay. Well, the churches in Algeria are suffering quite a bit. Several have been ordered to close, haven't been reopened. Several Christians have been arrested in Algeria. So with other organizations, we drafted a letter in support of the churches and the Christians in Algeria. That's been presented to members of the European Parliament, and they've signed on to the letter. We send it, or they send it, to the president of Algeria and to the Algerian embassy in Brussels. And well, we got a response last week, so we will focus on the details of that letter and work with the European Parliament to increase the attention, to come up with some practical suggestions. So that's one thing. Well, there's an issue in Turkey, so we've been working with other organizations as well to engage the Council of Europe and see how we can use that, their officials and that body to promote and defend freedom of religion or belief in Turkey. So these are very practical things. We've also been working, well, in EPRID, so that's the platform that the European Evangelical Alliance, together with other organizations, established in Brussels. We've also been advocating for EU Special Envoy for the promotion of freedom of religion or belief outside the European Union. The current Commission took a long time to decide whether or not we would renew that mandate. And when they did, it took them another year to appoint a person. Well, having a name is great, but then what's the budget? What's the mandate? What's the staff that person will get to do the job? So that's another thing that we are working on. Very practical. Make sure that person gets the right budget and the right support to do a meaningful job.
Tell me, Arie, how has the corona crisis affected the way you work? Your home is actually in Gouda. That's where you and your wife live. But you need to be in Brussels. But how has it affected the way you've worked for the last 18 months?
Well, most of the work has been online. So most of the meetings went online. Most of the contacts went digital, which is definitely complicating things.
Officials as well, yes.
Yeah, the European Parliament was just closed. The building was closed. So even whatever you wanted, you couldn't get in. And that's where like Christel also explained, it's the kind of the informal contacts over a cup of coffee in the corridors of the European Parliament that can make a tremendous difference in EU policies or the way evangelicals are perceived at European level. So yeah, that was definitely complicating things. So we had to focus a little bit more on writing and working through emails, making phone calls. But yeah, it is definitely different.
Mm-hmm. Okay, listen, I just want to say to any of the listeners, if you've got something, some thoughts that have come up, questions you'd like to ask, you can write them in. And I think we're going to invite Julia and Christel to come back into the studio and be ready to answer any questions that do come up. Irina will put a question up if it's come in. But what I'd like to ask each of you is, what was key for you in terms of preparation for this kind of work? What would you say to young people today when they're considering careers as to how they could be involved in this kind of work? This is not really the kind of work that's often promoted, in the church. By example, you need to be a pastor or maybe a missionary and so on, an evangelist. But to work in politics is not so much seen as a kingdom of God thing. But I think from what all you've been saying is very clear, we need a lot more people to really seriously seek God as to whether this is not the area that God is calling them to be involved in. So, Julia, what would you like to say?
Well, things are different now compared to back in the 1990s. The way I got involved was, well, I did European studies, so Europe was on my heart. But in terms of politics and Christianity, learning from heroes of the past. So, yeah, you talk a lot about that, Jeff. So Comenius, Fry, Butler, Wilberforce, Dunant, loads of just learning how God has used Christians in politics was inspiring. I read John Stott's Issues Facing Christians Today, which was sort of my foundational text. But now things are better. There are quite a few mentoring projects. So Christel and I run one called Cross Currents. It's with IFES, and we run the politics program. So I know Christel, we're just coming to an end of the second one of that, but hopefully there might be one in the future. So there are ways of young people engaging and learning. But I think my number one thing to say to people if they're thinking of getting involved in politics as a Christian is to ask God to shape your character first. It's not about ambition to get elected and have power, etc. It's if you're going to be Christ's ambassador in the public arena, there will be lots of temptations and lots of pressures. So ask God to shape your character first.
Thank you, Julia. What about you, Christel?
Well, I concur with everything Julia said, and if I were younger now, and I would probably try to subscribe to like the online accounts of organizations, Christian organizations that try to promote a Christian understanding of the world, and follow them, subscribe to their newsletters, because that's also progressively how I would find more and more information or opportunities to engage. A place to start is the European Evangelical Alliance, the Schuman Center. If it's helpful, people can also follow me and some of the things that I post. As a matter of fact, I think politics today has gotten possibly more confusing, more polarized. And Jeff, you mentioned Robert Schuman and his vision for a soul for Europe, and you explained that this vision for a soul for Europe was deeply connected to the Christian worldview. And I think that's possibly the number one challenge, not only for younger Christians, for all Christians, to develop and seek to understand what the Christian worldview is. What is a human being? What is the meaning of life? What is the meaning of authority? What are also Christian approaches to government and things of that sort? That's really important to break away from that confusion which we see, try and see reality with the eyes of God. That's not only intellectual. We are, disciples of Christ, and Christ invites us to a journey of discipleship. Discipleship is a whole of life journey, and so that has to do with things we learn. That has to do with things we do, and a lifestyle we have. So, yeah, that begins today. What kind of lifestyle will I cultivate? What kind of sources would I expose myself to? If I can do just a little plug for those who would be interested in following me on the social media, there are major elections coming in Germany and in France, I decided together with my wife to work on certain resources from like sort of the younger generation, how to view politics and our role as Christian citizens. So if people follow me in the coming months, I will publish some of that in my social media platforms on Instagram and on Facebook.
Excellent. Thank you, Christel. And Arie, what would you say to somebody? You need to you talked about the need for staff for this special ambassador for religious freedom, for example. The need is huge. How can people prepare for that?
Well, I think I totally agree with what Christel and Julia already said. Let me add that there is no perfect preparation for any engagement in politics. So if you have a certain expertise, that will come in very handy as well. At the moment, we are working on a project with artificial intelligence. Well, if you are a generalist, what do you know about artificial intelligence, and how can you speak into that debate with any influence and with any impact? You need a specialist. So we have a wonderful group of people at the moment that are working with us from a legal perspective, from a technical perspective, from a medical profession, and all of them come together to work with us and to speak into that debate that is currently taking place at the European Union about artificial intelligence and how we want to deploy that or don't want to deploy that in Europe. So if you have the passion to get involved and to be the change that you want to see in our societies, well, you with any expertise, join any of the networks that the European Evangelical Alliance has, or any of the local networks that you have, and use your expertise to help politicians, to help us to speak into the debate more meaningful, because our time is always limited, our knowledge is limited, so we need the expertise of anyone which come to the European Union with that Christian mindset and the technical expertise, and I think that combination is always gold for us as a European Evangelical Alliance and as representative in Brussels.
That's right.
I think what we've been talking about here today is what we can call public theology, and this is an area that in our constituency we haven't been very strong in the past. We've been strong in areas of personal discipleship and church planting and evangelism, but beyond that, what does the gospel really have to say to all these other areas of life? And actually, there's very few courses available. Redcliffe College and All Nations now, they've merged. They have an excellent course on missiology of European studies, and we offer as a Schuman Center, together with 4 Mission College, a missional leadership and European studies course, and these are master's degree programs. But there's very, very little from our constituency that's addressing this area of looking at Europe as a whole. There are some very good local programs on certain areas of public life. And it's very interesting that you mentioned John Stott's seminal book, Issues Facing Christians Today. I think it came out in mid-1980s and had several updated editions. But, you know, there was one issue that it didn't touch on at all, and that's the issue that's occasioned a whole polarization in Britain, and that was the issue of Europe. And that's what I discovered when I became European Director of Youth with a Mission back in 1990, and I tried to find people I could learn from. We didn't think that way. We didn't go there. I had to go to Catholic sources to find biblical teaching about how to think bigger picture. And this is a need, and some of us are really thinking, how can we help meet that need? And I would like to just throw in here an advertisement for our Summer School of European Studies that we run with Professor Evert van der Pol. We run it here in Amsterdam, July the 12th to the 16th. And this is an excellent beginning point for understanding the past, the present, and the future of Europe within a biblical framework. But you guys have been real pioneers and pathfinders, and, you know, going in areas that few people have gone before from our constituency. I want to commend you for that. But we need to work on ways in which we'll find many people to come and follow you up in generations to come. Is there any last thing any of you'd like to say to your listeners?
One word: hope.
That's good.
That's a good word.
Yeah, and engage. Just be present, whether that's locally or nationally or at European level. be there as a Christian. Make yourself known. Show people that you care about certain topics, and build the bridges into society.
And Psalm 2 is one of my favorite Psalms. It says that the nations plot against God's Holy One, and then the one in heaven, he laughs. So if you get gloomy and depressed about what's going on in the world, and sometimes there's good reason for that, don't worry. God is on his throne and he laughs. He's in control.
If we lay hold of the Lord's Prayer to say, Lord, may your kingdom come. In other words, may your will be done in Europe as it is in heaven. Let's remember, it's always God's will for God's will to be done. He wouldn't tell us to pray that prayer if he didn't have plans in mind. And Christel's just mentioned the word hope. We need to recognize that the story of Jesus has been the single greatest influence in shaping the story of Europe. Why can't shaping the past? So why couldn't it be the single greatest influence in shaping the future? And in the Schuman Center, we talk about jogging people's memories, understanding what God has done in the past, and then stirring people's conscience. How do we respond now to the situation? Arie's been talking about the refugees, for example. And then awakening imagination about the future. What could Europe look like? Let's repent from our fatalism and our negativity and thinking, it's all been predetermined to get worse and worse and worse. It'll be a self-fulfilling prophecy if all the Christians believe that. But we need to recognize that what God has done in the past, he can do again in the future. And he doesn't need a majority. He's worked all the way through history, through minorities. And Julia started mentioning some of these names. And this is a real hobby horse of mine to talk about this faithful minorities who have shaped Europe through their faith. So thank you very much for your faithful engagement there in the heart of Brussels as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been a pleasure being with you.
If any of the listeners would like more information about the summer school, info@schumancenter.eu. Well, we're going to take a summer break for July and August before we come back together for the Schuman Talks on the 9th of September. And as we explained at the beginning, we start on the 9th day of each month at 6 p.m. because it was on the 9th of May at 6 p.m. in 1950 when Robert Schuman gave this 3-minute talk that really was, in my book at least, the defining moment of Europe, of post-war Europe. And this man made a difference. May we be stirred to have gifts of faith and hope and vision for the future of this Europe as well. Thank you very much for being with us. God bless. Till September.